Well, I'm Joe Pitzer, and I was born in Cleveland, Ohio, October 19th, 1932. I was born in the Deaconess Hospital, which was on Broadway in Cleveland. My dad and his parents came from Germany. They cooked a lot of German food. I think it was called Hassenpfeffer. It was a particular way to cook a rabbit, so it was kind of sour. And I never particularly cared for it, but I didn't tell them. When I would visit my grandmother's home, I thought it was very interesting how they prayed. Bless this food and its tender juice. I would think that what they were really saying was in German, bless this food to its intended use. And I always, when I sat there at their table, I thought, what are they talking about, this tender juice kind of thing? Cleveland at that time was close to 1 million people, and there was everything under the sun present. And people came from their native countries and lived in areas where their native people were. The first wife I married, which was in 1953, her parents were born on a houseboat in the Netherlands. And so they came to a Dutch colony. Now, they didn't care for me too much to start with because I wasn't Dutch. After about 20 years, they believed that I was okay anyhow. And I did marry their daughter. And they did look askance at me for quite a while. When I was 2, my parents lived on the west outskirts of Cleveland. And we always heard strange stories about what went on in these ethnic areas. And so us kids from the suburbs were always kind of afraid to go in downtown Cleveland. But being an adventuresome person, I kind of enjoyed it. And frankly, because of the ethnic groups, they were probably pretty well behaved. Half of Cleveland was Catholic, and many of those folks were well behaved. People that came from Poland, a lot of Germans. So I didn't see much of it played out. My dad was about 27 years old when he got acquainted with my mother, who worked at the telephone company. And he was a 7th grade graduate, although the only things I saw in our home in terms of literature were chemistry, physics, electronics, math, and that kind of thing. My dad was a brilliant man, but he stayed there long enough that they found out that he was a brilliant guy, and he ended up being the director of human services, and he retired from there. He was manager of personnel. And if you've ever been in Cleveland, the AT&T building, American Telephone and Telegraph, is about the tallest building in downtown Cleveland. Our early years, we had very little. I was an only child and not a typical only child. I had one new bicycle in my lifetime, and my parents, when I was in college, did not send me $5. My dad paid my tuition the first 2 years. I paid everything else. I maintained 3 part-time jobs here in Fort Wayne, and that's what made life a little tough, okay? But that's the best thing that could happen. I remember my dad and I sitting in front of a radio, and my dad was so intent on listening to it. So I moved over and listened with him, and I said, Dad, what's going on? He said, the Japanese are bombing Pearl Harbor. And that was on December 7th, 1941. And so thereafter, the only news we got was what we saw by pictures in the newspaper. We had blackouts in Cleveland, and every house and every business in all of Cleveland was to be shut off, so that if the enemy bombers would fly over, they wouldn't be able to see the city. And my dad was responsible for everybody being blacked out on our block. And there was a big sign in our front yard that said Air Raid Warden. So you knew that my dad was the one that would be around checking. My dad spent 2 years in the service. The telephone company loaned him as a civil worker 1 year to the Army, 1 year to the Navy. He taught officers communication skills so that they could teach their officers communication skills. Everything was rationed: butter, milk, cigarettes, that kind of thing. One time we had a tough roast my mother cooked. And I said, "Mom, I can hardly chew this darn thing." She said, "Well, now I got to tell you and your dad that this was horse meat. And you could get horse meat when you couldn't get regular beef." So that was an interesting experience too. I was here in Fort Wayne, although I lived in Cleveland. A friend of mine brought me up here to be on his parents' farm for a while. That's where I learned to love Indiana. And so I was in Fort Wayne on VJ Day, Victory in Japan. That was when the airplanes flew over and dropped leaflets, and people were out on the streets hugging one another and so on. That was a real memory to me in my lifetime, and my kids and so on. I hope we'll never see that kind of thing again. My years between the ages of 10 and 15 or 16, we had a bunch of boys in our neighborhood, and we played a lot of basketball and touch football and baseball. And so I had a happy childhood in that regard. But when my dad whistled and he could be heard 2 blocks away, man, I better be headed home, or he'd be there with a switch on my bare legs. And so I learned discipline, and today I'm pretty well disciplined. Even though I don't like some things that were required of me, I did them anyhow. And that way I've been much more successful because of that training. I was the pitcher on our softball team in our neighborhood, and we went into town in Cleveland and we played other teams there. Well, we won the championship, and I remember there was a trophy. And we boys tried to decide who should take that trophy home. And it was given to me because I was the pitcher. And I don't know what I did with that trophy, but I still wished I had it. It meant something to me at that time. Because the school I was going to, called John Marshall, my dad sent me to that school, which was in Cleveland. And it was traditional in Cleveland that the winning school, high school on the west side played the winning school on the east side, which was all black. Our school only had a few black. And the interesting thing, well, the sad thing that happened was that our school won by just a couple of points, all white players. And there was a riot after that. And the girl that I had dated was with another guy, and he got stabbed in the back. He didn't know it, but she pulled a knife out of his back when they were riding home in the car. And it was that incident that caused night games, sports, to be canceled in Cleveland at that time. I didn't go to downtown Cleveland very often, especially on the deep east side, because I didn't feel that I was welcome, as most whites didn't feel in the black neighborhood, and the blacks didn't feel that on the west side in the white neighborhoods. I never heard the word God or church for the first 10 years of my life. That wasn't necessarily because my parents didn't know those things. They just didn't talk about it and didn't introduce me to it. And it was my grandmother that I credit for inviting me over to her home and seeing them pray. And I remember 3 plaques she had on the wall. One of them was, "For God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten son," and you know the rest of that. Another one said, "God is the silent guest in our home, the silent participant in every meal, the silent listener to every conversation, so in a sense, behave." But I remember when my grandmother took me upstairs to a bedroom. They had 4 bedrooms in there, and she said, now we're going to pray. And I said, what are you talking about, Graham? She said, well, kneel down beside the bed here with me and repeat after me. Now I lay me down to sleep. I pray thee, Lord, my soul to keep. If I should die before I wake, I pray the Lord my soul to take. And that was an introduction to prayer. Of course, I heard them pray every meal for this food and tender juice. So, not so long after my grandmother had me kneel, but she turned me over to my uncle, who was just a few years older than me, and he was to take me to church and Sunday school every Sunday, and we rode the streetcar there to the Brooklyn Missionary Church in Cleveland. The lady that taught the junior church, she did a flannel board. She cut out a black piece of paper and she sang this song, my heart was black with sin. She showed that black one until the Savior came in. His precious blood I know. She showed a red card, has washed it white as snow. She showed the white card. And in his word, I'm told, you can tell I can't sing, I'll walk the streets of gold. And she showed that gold card. And a wonderful, wonderful day, he washed my sins away, and she showed that white card. That got to me. That got to me, and I knew that I needed something like that. You know, right now I got a little emotional, but in those days, you couldn't reach my emotions, but that stuck with me. My faith simply changed by observing my grandparents. My grandfather especially was not what you'd call a good man. In fact, frankly, I don't know if I should say this. One time he and I visited, and he reminded me of his past, that he had every venereal disease known to man. And I remember my grandmother telling me how she went up to the tavern to get him away from the two-bit whores and so on. And she had a couple kids by that time, and she wanted to keep that family together. And I remember my grandmother saying to my grandfather across the table when I was there sharing a meal with them, they were talking about marriage. And my grandmother said to my grandfather, if I ever thought you'd marry again when I die, I'd scratch your eyes out right now. And I remember that. Eventually, soon after that, he developed pneumonia, and there was no cure for it then. But a minister, oddly enough, from here in Fort Wayne, his name was Clauser, he came and prayed for my grandfather, and he got well. And that was the thing that led them to Christ. And what a change I never saw. And they turned out to be a wonderful couple. They kept missionaries in their own home. They fed the poor. I was in my grandmother's home many times when bums would come to the back door and rap and want a meal, and my grandmother always sat them down and fed them. And she wasn't a preachy person, but she sure set a good example for me, and I thought there's something different about my grandparents. And that's one of the things that led me to listen to them and to seek out their Christ. Let me tell you about my grandfather. He completely changed from black to white. And he took me to my first professional football game in downtown Cleveland, and they were then known as the Cleveland Rams. And then they became the Cleveland Browns. He took me to my first professional baseball game. He took me to my first professional all-star baseball game, and I watched Ted Williams hit a home run over the right field fence. In about 1948, my dad took me to a baseball game, a professional baseball game in Cleveland, to watch the Cleveland Indians play the Chicago White Sox. The Indians won the game on a two-hitter, 3-2. There were 60,000 people there, the largest night crowd ever. And guess who pitched for the Cleveland Indians? It wasn't Bob Feller, it was Satchel Paige. So I saw Satchel Paige pitch. My grandfather was the first one to take me on a golf course, and I loved it. I loved it. He was the first one that let me drive his car. That was probably a mistake, but we did, and I remember that. He had a Chevrolet about in 1947 when they started making cars again. I remember hitchhiking to Virginia. My uncle was a Methodist minister there, and so when I was 13 years old, I took off and hitchhiked all the way down there. That was one of my big experiences in life, because on the way home, I was hitchhiking and I got deathly ill. And I puked and this, that, and the other thing. And I was laying alongside the road. It happened to be right across the road from where the dirigible had crashed, called the Shenandoah. And I felt good enough to go over there and look at that monument. And it gave tribute to the Shenandoah. But a truck driver came along and picked me up. And that truck shook everything out of me. And by the time I got home, that was one thing that helped me appreciate home. I was so glad to get home, although I wasn't tied to home, but I was glad to have a home to go to then, because that was better than laying out on the highway somewhere. I didn't take books home from school when I hitchhiked home, but I did on that particular day. I had one on my lap. And the guy that was the driver reached over and tried to get under my books, and I said, "Whoa, you let me off up here. You got the wrong guy." And that happened to me, and that was a unique experience. I did not like school. I just did not like school. I have what you call ADD, attention deficit disorder. And when I was in school, I don't care what the teacher was talking about, my mind was elsewhere. And so I missed a lot of things because of that, having that. And I still have that. I still have that. And it's something I battle. I have to keep my mind on things. I wasn't the brightest candle on the cake, as I've said before. And I got passing grades. I think in college, the lowest grade I ever got was a couple C's, mostly B's and a few A's to match up with it. But they didn't get on my case about that kind of thing. They didn't get on my case about hitchhiking around the city of Cleveland. And my parents eventually, because they made quite a change, they were going to separate as soon as I got out of high school, but because of their change religiously, they became Christians, being honest. And so that made a difference in our family, and my parents did not separate. And my dad actually took care of my mother, who had a stroke at age 38. She lived to 76, and he saw to it for those 38 years that she was cared for. An example to me, caring for my Alzheimer's wife, you better believe it. I was sitting next to a kid in homeroom the first day. The teacher read off the names, and she said, Joseph Pitzer. I said, "Here." And this kid next to me said, "Your name's Pitzer?" And I said, "Yeah." He said, "Did you have some relatives lived on 158th Street?" And I said, "Yeah." He said, "Did you have a cousin who was a tap dancer?" I said, "Yes." He said, "Well, they ruined my parents' floors, wooden floors. She tap danced and just tore those floors up." But he and I became good friends, and one day he said to me, he says, "I have a nice-looking cousin, goes to school here. I'm sure you never met her." But she happens to be a Christian gal, and she's pretty straightforward, and I'd like you to meet her. So he showed me to her. She sang in choir, and they practiced in the morning. So he took me by, and I saw her, and I thought, she's not a bad-looking chick, you know. Her name was Jeanette Hines, H-E-I-N-S. Believe it or not, it was a Dutch name, although most Dutch names end in S-M-A. She lived fairly close to the school, so I ended up walking home from school with her just to carry her books and that kind of thing. And one thing led to another. And my first date with her was on my buddy's motor scooter. This buddy's name was Ray Zenker, great friend of mine. She was appealing to me because she was pretty straightforward in terms of her Christian devotion. I know she didn't do certain things, and I knew that she read the scripture after every meal. And she brought that into our marriage, and my daughter here will remember reading the scripture after meals. That was because Jeanette, my wife, insisted on that. Yeah, she was a woman of few words, but you knew after you'd been around her for a while that she was a very dedicated, very organized, a very devoted person. And she did a lot of things good for people that nobody knew about because she was so quiet. I went to work in a factory near downtown Cleveland. It was near where my grandmother lived. They kind of lived in the inner city. And I worked there in a factory. It was called Fanner Manufacturing, and they manufactured metal products called chaplets. And when I first started there, I worked in the area where they smelted metal. And it was so hot in there, 100 and some degrees. And they finally transferred me to the shipping department, which I liked a whole lot better because it wasn't 110, 112 degrees there. I got tired of that kind of stuff, and I thought, man, if you're ever going to make something out of yourself, now's the time to do it. So even though I'd been out of school for a year, I decided to go to college. And so I talked to my minister about a certain college. It happened to be Fort Wayne Christian College, which became later Taylor University. And my minister said, hey, Joe, I know you're not used to a life that's regimented and so on. If you sign on the line to go there, I'll tell you they'll make it tough on you. It was the only college I really knew, and my friend took me there, took me here to Fort Wayne to visit on his parents' farm. And that was the way I got acquainted with Fort Wayne, etc. And I loved it. I didn't know that the university would be so darn straight-laced, but it was a good thing for me, actually. And if they found out some of the things I did, they'd have booted me out of school. But sometimes I missed the chapel services because I hitchhiked to Cleveland late at night to see my girlfriend. And I just decided that I was right and they didn't know what they were doing. And I still feel that to this day, that there was no need to keep couples apart, that they couldn't hold hands and things like that. I met with the Dean of Men, and I said, Mr., and I'll not say his name, but he was a great guy. It's just that I didn't get along with him. He said, I'm getting married at the end of this second year. He said, you can't come back to school here then. I said, no kidding. I said, what do you think I am, some sort of ascetic? And they deny themselves for the sake of the spiritual. Boy, and he stood up and he said, Mr. Pitzer, such a slurring remark. I said, well, that's the way I feel about it. I said, why don't you go to your committee and tell them I'm going to go to a different school unless they let me come back. So about a month later, he called me in and he said, they'll let you return to school if she enrolls in school here too. I said, okay, that's a deal. I enrolled her in school in piano lessons. And I've That was the letter of the law fulfilled. In fact, that first year she had 2 operations and she had to drop out. They never said another word to me, and they knew that they were wrong because they knew that I had become successful in Fort Wayne as a teacher and as an administrator. And there were probably 4 or 5, 6 others from the school who also became administrators from the college. She planned it. When I say she, I mean Jeanette and her parents, and they only allowed so many people because they didn't have a whole lot of money. I remember I lost a good friend over that because I forgot to include his name. And when I came later and said, hey, I need a place for one more, they said, sorry. And he and I never spoke again. The wedding was at a small, what they call a Christian Reformed church, which was actually Dutch Reformed, July 24th. It was a very small church because there weren't very many Dutch people in that area of town. We went on a short honeymoon. I had $200, which we got from the wedding. So we went to the Smoky Mountains for about 7 days. In fact, I worked at the airport for the rest of that summer, where I had worked the 2 summers before, preparing tanks for future use in Army. And many of them were being set aside. And so we had, when I say we, us teenage boys that were in college and so on, we had to prepare the tank to be stored out in the desert or something like that. And that was an interesting thing too, being in that turret and moving the gun around and things like that. I knew a guy who lived in a particular place that belonged to the Fort Wayne Housing Authority. We thought his wife had brain cancer and he had to move out. I never saw the place. I said, you only pay $8.50 a month? And he said, yeah. I said, I'm going to take that place. It probably wasn't over 500 square feet. And so the day we moved up to Fort Wayne was the first time I was in the place. Boy, was I heart sick. There was no hot water. There was no water heater. There was no telephone. There was a pot-bellied stove. There was linoleum on the floor. I hesitate to say how many square feet, but they were like about 10 by 10. And so that's where we moved, and that's where we stayed. And that $8.50 a month really helped me to get through school. It was very difficult for her. She'd never been away from home. And she could be a very nervous person. So she had some problems with nerves being away from home. And I realized that I had asked an awful lot of her. Yeah, she got over it. And at the end of the 4th year, we moved out. And Jennifer was born when I graduated. And my son was born 2 years after that. I don't think Jennifer could tell you that they ever heard us fight, nor even argue. When the kids were old enough to go to school and be in school all day, she went to work as an aide in the community schools, and it made a different person out of her. She loved it, and she was good at it. She was shy, but she loved working with those kids. When those kids would have a birthday, she'd be taking a cake out of the house. And I said, what's that for? Well, so-and-so's having a birthday and so on. And she'd buy him a new pair of shoes, and she worked with emotionally handicapped. And she was good at it. Many years later, I remember my father-in-law calling me on the telephone and saying, I just wanted to compliment you on how good you've been to my daughter and how you've cared for her. And that's what I want you to know. And in high school, at John Marshall High School, I had a couple of teachers that were excellent. And I actually began liking their classes. One of them was named Mrs. Berghoff, and she taught law, and that was so interesting. she'd give us cases and we had to respond to them and things like that. And I thought, this is actually kind of good, you know? And so those things weighed on my mind, and I put them together and thought, gee, if I could be that kind of teacher, I'd love it. I knew by the time I graduated from college in 4 years that I wanted to become a teacher. I knew I wasn't the kind of guy that'd make a good pastor. I had my own ideas, and I had some diverse views on things. So I went back to IU and went there in the summer here in town. And I also spent 2 summers down in Bloomington. And so I ended up with 6 full years of college, plus the master's. And I don't mind saying that the principal at McCulloch School, where I first taught, she realized that I could appeal to those kids who were far out and needed a little discipline and so on, because I was not only firm and fair, but I was fun. And I knew how to get to those guys. And that was always my forte, even when I became principal. I taught 8 years, and then I was another year as an assistant principal at Harmer School. After 9 years, I became full-time principal at Adams School, and that lasted for 26 years. In those days, religion and school were difficult things to marry together and harmonize, but I had no fear. When I was principal at Adams School, on a Friday when we'd part, I'd always get on the PA every Friday and say, well, now kids, it's the weekend. And remember, math and reading is not the only thing. You know, there are churches in this neighborhood, and some of you need to be there and find out a little bit about God. And if your parents don't go, get them to go with you. You need to know something about God, because life isn't forever. It just so happened that at Adams School, I was known as a friendly, smiling guy, and I got along with the teachers. I very seldom chewed any teacher out. I always believed in identifying the good traits, and they knew that. And our staff was a good staff, so why did I need to be otherwise? At 49, I was really taken back when the doctor told me I better have heart surgery. I was 98% in one artery, 96 in another, 95 in another, and 90 in the fourth. And I said to the Dr. Scaringa, what are my chances? He said, if you don't have something done, I could give you maybe a year. It's a kind of a genetic thing because my mother had high cholesterol, 600. My dad had had a couple small heart attacks too. But after I had it and felt so much better, I was so happy. And the teachers at school told me that too. You're a different guy now. I just felt good because I physically felt good, and I could walk, I could run, I could do a lot of things, and so I related to people better. I became optimistic. I was able to make it through God's help in a number of circumstances. And the glass is half full kind of guy. There was a guy, he said, attitude is everything. And so I tried to maintain an attitude that was, I'll make it no matter what. I sang in the men's quartet in high school, and I sang in the college quartet when we traveled around on a Christmas vacation advertising the school according to male quartet, a cappella kind of thing. And I really like that. I can sing, in fact, I did sing baritone, but I could sing bass also. And in the high school quartet, I sang bass. And my voice is not bass anymore. I cannot sing. The illnesses I have caused me to lose my voice. And the voice you're hearing now was not my normal voice. I had a nice, clear, bass, resounding voice. I'm a walking miracle. I've had 2 open heart surgeries. I've had 5 repaired aneurysms. I've had 2 back surgeries. I've had at least 12 surgeries, different things in my body that I won't talk about. I have stenosis of the spine. I cannot stand up more than 3 or 4 minutes at a time. My back will not hold me. I really appreciate the verse, trust not in your own understanding, but give your ways to God and He will direct your paths. And that's been a real impetus for me. It started at 51, and it showed itself by several small things, which many people wouldn't notice. It was before Christmas one year, and I'd bought her a camera with a flash attachment. And so we sat down on the couch. It was like Christmas Eve or something. And I showed her how the flash attachment worked. And when I got all done, she said to me, "Isn't there a flash attachment to this?" And I knew then something was wrong. And down in the basement, we had a cabinet. And when she'd go shopping, she'd always buy a can of cleanser. When I looked in the cabinet down there were 13 cans of cleanser. And I knew something was wrong. And we had fried chicken breast every night for quite a while. And I knew, man, we're in trouble. And she was really angry. I bought her a new car, one of those real small Buicks. And a year later, I had to sell it because she was driving so erratically. And she was pretty angry at me for that. I said, "Babe, the doctor has given you certain medications, and you're taking them now. And you can't be driving and taking these medications because our insurance wouldn't cover us. And if we had an accident, we might lose a lot." About 12 years after that, why? Because when Mary Lou and Bob would come over, she'd get Mary Lou aside, and I'd be sitting in my chair, and Jeanette would say to Mary Lou, "Who is that guy over there?" She was full of rhythm, and I was a klutz. We were watching the Gaithers. The TV was over there, she was over there, and I was over here. And we were clapping to the music with the Gaithers. And she said to me, "You know, my husband Joe, he never could keep time either." I was a very unemotional person. I can't cry. The first time I ever actually cried, and I might shed a tear here, was when the day that I sent my wife to the nursing home. That was in 1993. And I had her caregiver that I had paid every day to take her for a ride for 4 hours. I had Mom get in that car, and she drove out. And I carried the stuff that we wanted in the nursing home, and my friend Bill Regel stayed with me. And when they pulled out that driveway, I'm talking about this caregiver of hers, I broke down. First time in my life I ever cried. I bawled like a baby because I thought, here went the rest of my life, and I'm only 50-some years old. I didn't handle it very well, judged on the first night at home. After I took her to the nursing home, I drove around until about 2 o'clock in the morning. And I said to myself, "Joe, you've got to face this." And I remember the next day I had to wash some clothes. And I thought, gee whiz, it's about time you learned how to do this. You got no choice. So I made up my mind I had to learn to wash the clothes. I had to fix my own breakfast. I had to take care of my own lunch and maybe go out for supper somewhere. And it was terribly difficult, terribly difficult. She was very unhappy to begin with, and it didn't take long to discover that they were giving her the wrong antidepressant. And so they changed that, and she went from a very sad, crying person to a very happy person. Yeah, and I had no problems with her being there then. But then we got used to it. Jeanette was in that home for 8 years, and I went every day. So I've been trying to carry on at school with her being in the nursing home and things like that, and it got to be a pretty heavy burden. And I realized that for my own health, I ought to take the opportunity to retire because I could get part of my pension and so on. It was a tough time. It was a tough time financially because I had to pay for health. The community schools did not pay a health plan for me. I wouldn't recommend being a caregiver to anyone except that. Guess who's on my list of every night in prayer? All my known caregivers, because I know how bad they need it. But her mother died of Alzheimer's, and her mother had one brother and 2 sisters, and they all died of Alzheimer's. The teachers were so understanding and the staff was so understanding, I can never thank them enough. And I do. We meet once a year before school starts, and I always manage to thank them again for being so thoughtful, so careful, so kind. Jeanette used to, at the end of school and so on, she would have a dinner at our house and have all the teachers and so on. They remembered that. For all the heartaches and all the tears, for all the gloomy days and unfruitful years, I give my thanks. For I now know those were things that helped me grow. And that was the best thing that ever happened to me. Although I've lost several $100,000, and I really have, yet God has been good to me. And I met Shirley, and so a year after Mom died, I married Shirley and we got on fine, except that we didn't get to travel the places we wanted to either. I did the motivational speaking in churches and in nursing homes and who knows where. Some people would come to my house, I would go to their house. I just enjoyed doing that. That was a redeeming factor because I realized, having been a caregiver, how stressful it is and what there is to be learned. And having learned some of those things, the job becomes a little bit easier. It's kind of like my current wife having raised 7 kids. And that's one reason why she never went to bed at midnight. And she worked till 5 o'clock in the morning. And she's still bound with that habit. And right now I've lost 70 pounds and I look like, frankly, one of those prisoners of war that was let out of the prison camp at the end of the war. I've lost 70 pounds in the last year. We have not caught up yet with what's causing that. And if we don't, who cares? My biggest thrill is my family and my grandchildren and my great-grandchildren. I never made a fortune, and it's probably too late now, but I don't worry about that much. I'm happy anyhow. And as I go along life's way, I'm reaping better than I sowed. I'm drinking from my saucer because my cup has overflowed. I don't have a lot of riches, and sometimes the going's tough, but I have loved ones around me, and that makes me rich enough. So I thank God for his blessings and the mercy he has showed. And as he gives me strength and courage, I'll help others bear their loads. Amen.